The ink never dried. That was the first thing Thomas Alden noticed when he received the peculiar notebook in the mail. There was no sender, no return address, just a brown paper package with his name scrawled across the front in an elegant, looping script. He had almost tossed it aside, thinking it was a misplaced order, but something about the weight of the parcel, the way it seemed to hum with an invisible energy, made him hesitate. Inside, he found a leather-bound book with yellowed pages and a single fountain pen resting in the fold. The pen was heavy, its black body cool to the touch, and when he twisted it open, he found no ink reservoir inside. Curious, he flipped the notebook open. The first page bore an inscription in the same elegant handwriting that had spelled out his name on the package. To the one who will write tomorrow, may your hand be steady and your mind clear. There was no signature, no explanation. Thomas frowned, tapping the pen against the empty page. The moment the tip met paper, a line of impossibly black ink flowed out, smooth and fluid. He lifted the pen, expecting smudges or a wet sheen, but the ink did not dry. It remained as fresh as the moment he had written it. Something about this unsettled him. He was not a superstitious man, nor was he prone to imagination. His life was built on predictability, his job as a data analyst keeping him firmly grounded in numbers and logic. He had no patience for mystery. And yet, he could not bring himself to close the notebook. His fingers moved of their own accord, and before he fully understood what he was doing, words began to spill onto the page. The phone rings at precisely 7:36 p.m. The voice on the other end will be unfamiliar, hesitant. It will deliver news that will change everything. Thomas stared at the words, his pulse quickening. He hadn't meant to write them. They had simply appeared. A nervous laugh escaped his lips. This was ridiculous. He was playing into some elaborate trick, a prank crafted by a friend with a taste for theatrics. And yet, at 7:36 p.m., his phone rang. The sound nearly made him drop the notebook. Heart pounding, he hesitated before answering. Hello. A silence stretched on the other end before a woman's voice, soft and uncertain, spoke. Is this Thomas Alden? His throat felt tight. Yes. The woman inhaled sharply. I don't know how to say this, but I found something. Something that belongs to you. Something important. Thomas clutched the pen, his knuckles whitening. Who is this? A pause. My name is Evelyn. I think I found your future. The line went dead. Thomas stared at the phone in his trembling hand. He looked down at the notebook, at the words that refused to dry. He turned the page. The pen in his hand twitched. More words began to form before his eyes. Words he hadn't yet written. Thomas Alden did not believe in fate. He did not believe in premonitions, prophecies, or the whispered promises of an unseen future. And yet, as he stared at the ink-black words forming on the page before him, words that he had not written, he could not deny the weight settling in his chest. She will call again at midnight. You must answer. His fingers went cold. He pushed the notebook away as if it had suddenly become a living thing, something with breath and will of its own. The air in his small apartment felt too thick, pressing against his ribs. He reached for his phone, half expecting another call, but the screen remained dark. The name Evelyn swam in his thoughts, a stranger whose voice had trembled as she spoke of finding his future. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. This was absurd. It had to be a coincidence. And yet, the first prediction had come true. The phone had rung. The words had shaped reality, or had reality shaped the words? He needed answers. Flipping the notebook closed, he grabbed his jacket and left his apartment, the city swallowing him in a hum of neon and distant sirens. The bookstore on Grayson Street was old, wedged between two newer establishments like a relic forgotten by time. The bell above the door chimed softly as Thomas stepped inside. A man stood behind the counter, grey-bearded and hunched over a cup of tea. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over Thomas in a way that made him feel as though he had already been expected. You look troubled, the man said, setting his tea aside. Lost something? Maybe, Thomas admitted. He reached into his bag, pulled out the notebook, and placed it on the counter. Do you recognize this? The bookseller's face did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, an understanding, perhaps. He reached out and ran a finger along the spine of the book. Ah, he murmured. So it has found another. Thomas stiffened. Another? The bookseller met his gaze. Where did you get it? I don't know, Thomas said. It arrived in the mail. No sender, no return address. The bookseller nodded as if this confirmed something. It always arrives that way. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? The old man sighed, motioning for Thomas to sit. He did. The scent of aged paper and tea filled the air. That book, the man said, tapping the cover, has passed through many hands. It does not choose lightly. It finds those who are meant to hold it. Thomas swallowed hard. And what exactly is it? The bookseller's gaze darkened. It is a book that writes the future. The words sent a chill down Thomas's spine. I don't believe in that, he said quickly. The bookseller chuckled. You will. The weight of the notebook suddenly felt heavier. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, and Thomas's eyes flicked to his phone. 11:57 p.m. 3 minutes until midnight. His pulse hammered in his ears. The bookseller must have noticed. Something's coming, isn't it? Thomas hesitated, then nodded. The bookseller smiled faintly. Then you'd best answer. Midnight struck, and the phone began to ring. The ringtone shattered the quiet of the bookstore, sending a tremor through Thomas's chest. The bookseller, still seated across from him, did not move. His gaze was steady, knowing. Thomas hesitated, the phone vibrating in his hand. You must answer, the notebook had written. His breath felt shallow as he swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. Hello. A silence, thick and heavy. Then, you read it, didn't you? It was Evelyn. Her voice was softer this time, edged with something close to fear. Thomas swallowed. Who are you? You don't remember me, she murmured, almost to herself. But you will. A chill coiled around the base of his spine. What do you mean? I found your name, she said. In the book. Thomas's grip on the phone tightened. His gaze flicked to the notebook, still resting on the counter. You have one too. No, Evelyn said. I have yours. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. That's impossible, he said, his voice hoarse. I thought so too, she whispered. But the book I found, it has your name written inside. Your handwriting. Pages filled with things you haven't done yet. Thomas's stomach twisted. You're lying, he said, though he knew she wasn't. I wish I were. The bookseller remained silent, watching, listening. Thomas could feel the weight of his presence, the unspoken understanding in his eyes. Where are you? Thomas asked. Evelyn hesitated. I don't know if I should say. You called me, he reminded her. So you must want something. A sharp inhale. I need to meet you. In person. There are things in this book, things you need to see. Thomas glanced at the bookseller, who gave a slow, knowing nod. Where? Thomas asked. There was a pause. Then, the old train station. 1 hour. The line went dead. Thomas lowered the phone, his hands cold. The weight of the moment pressed against his ribs. The bookseller studied him. You're going, aren't you? Thomas exhaled sharply. Wouldn't you? The old man's lips twitched. Not all who write the future live to read it. Thomas ignored the warning. He grabbed the notebook, shoved it into his bag, and rose. As he stepped toward the door, the bookseller called out one last time. Be careful what you ask from the ink. The words followed him into the night. The old train station was a ruin of rust and forgotten time. Trains no longer ran through its platforms, and what remained of it was swallowed by shadows and broken glass. Thomas stood beneath the cracked archway, the wind whispering through the empty halls. A single street lamp flickered above, barely illuminating the desolation. Then, footsteps. He turned. A woman emerged from the darkness, a notebook clutched to her chest. Her hair was dark, her face half hidden in the glow of the street lamp. But it was her eyes that struck him, wide, searching, filled with an unease that mirrored his own. Evelyn. She held up the book in her hands. "This," she whispered, "was written by you." Thomas reached for it, but before his fingers could touch the cover, a gust of wind flipped the pages open. The ink inside had not dried, and on the last written page, the words gleamed under the dim light. "He will arrive at the station. He will meet her. And then..." The sentence ended there. The next page was blank. Waiting. Thomas looked up. Evelyn's lips parted, as if to speak. And then a shadow moved behind her. Someone else was there. Watching. Waiting. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The words on the page, the unfinished sentence, clawed at his thoughts. He will arrive at the station. He will meet her. And then... And then what? His gaze snapped to the darkness behind Evelyn, to the shadow that had shifted just beyond the dim glow of the street lamp. Someone was there. Someone was watching. "Evelyn," he whispered. She must have seen the fear in his eyes because she stiffened, her grip on the notebook tightening. Slowly, she turned her head, just enough to glimpse the shape lurking in the gloom. The silence stretched, deep and oppressive. Then, a footstep. Not hers. Not his. Someone else was moving in the station. Evelyn reacted first. She stepped back, closer to Thomas, her breath coming quick and shallow. "Who's there?" she called, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her unease. No answer. The shadow did not retreat. If anything, it loomed closer, pressing itself into the crumbling remains of the station's walls, as if drinking in the darkness. Then, from that silence, a voice emerged. "You shouldn't have read it." Thomas felt his skin prickle. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the empty station like an echo from somewhere impossibly far away. Evelyn stepped back again, bumping into Thomas's shoulder. His fingers itched toward the notebook in his bag. The ink that never dried. The words that had already predicted his every move. Whoever was standing there, did they know what would happen next? "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The shadow didn't respond. But then, another sound. A rustling. And a page, unseen, turning. Not from the book in Evelyn's hands. From somewhere else. Somewhere just beyond the veil of darkness. Then the voice spoke again, barely above a whisper. "You've written too much." Thomas's pulse pounded. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but neither existed here, not anymore. Evelyn swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" A pause. Then, as if reciting a passage from memory. "Not all who write the future live to read it." Thomas's blood ran cold. The bookseller's warning. The words he had tried to dismiss. The shadow shifted again. And this time, it moved toward them. Evelyn gasped, grabbing Thomas's wrist. "Run," she breathed. They didn't need to be told twice. They turned and fled, their footsteps pounding against the broken pavement. The wind howled through the station skeleton, chasing them as they ran beneath the dying glow of the street lamp. Behind them, the shadow did not follow in the way a person would. It did not run, did not chase. It spread. A consuming darkness, stretching outward, devouring light, swallowing sound. Thomas dared one last glance over his shoulder. And that was when he saw it. A hand. Not human. Not flesh. A hand made of ink. Reaching. And as it did, something strange happened. The ink on the page inside Evelyn's book shifted. The words, once static, began to change. The future was rewriting itself. Thomas's breath hitched. This wasn't just a book that wrote the future. Something else was writing it for him. They tore through the station's rusted gates, their hearts hammering, the city's streetlights glowing like lifelines in the distance. Only when they were far enough away, when the station was just a smudge of darkness behind them, did they stop. Panting, Evelyn turned to him, the book still clutched in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the page, then widened in horror. She turned the notebook toward him. Thomas looked, and there, in the ink that never dried, new words had appeared. They ran. "But it will find them again." A sharp wind tore through the night. And somewhere, unseen, a page turned. The ink gleamed under the dim glow of the street lamp. They ran. But it will find them again. The word sent a shiver through Thomas's spine, a cold and creeping certainty that whatever had lurked in the train station had not stayed behind. It had followed. Evelyn snapped the notebook shut as if closing it would make the words disappear. "We can't keep running," she said, breathless. "We need to figure out what this is. What it wants." Thomas wanted to tell her that was impossible. That this wasn't something they could reason with. But he swallowed the thought. It wouldn't help. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder. The station was just a jagged silhouette against the night, distant and silent. But something deep in his bones told him the danger had not passed. He turned back to Evelyn. "Your book, the one you say I wrote. You still have it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It's at my apartment. I didn't want to bring it out in the open. Not after what I read." Thomas's stomach twisted. "What did you read?" Evelyn hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Your death." The night air turned razor-sharp. Thomas felt the world tilt slightly beneath him, the words sinking into his mind like a slow-moving poison. He had barely begun to understand this mystery, and already it had written his ending. He exhaled sharply. "Then we need to change it." Evelyn nodded, though the fear in her eyes told him she wasn't sure that was possible. Evelyn's apartment was small, cluttered with books and scattered pages. A desk sat beneath a flickering lamp, its surface covered in open notebooks. But one stood apart from the rest. A leather-bound book, identical to the one in Thomas's bag. Evelyn approached it hesitantly, as if it might bite. She flipped it open to a bookmarked page and turned the book toward him. Thomas leaned in. His own handwriting stared back at him. He will return home, thinking he has escaped. But the ink does not forget. The ink does not forgive. And when he sleeps, it will come for him. Beneath it, a time was written. 3:42 a.m. Thomas's breath caught. He checked his watch. 3:10 a.m. A cold dread curled in his gut. "We need to destroy these," Evelyn said suddenly, snapping the book shut. "Both of them." Thomas hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind, but something told him it wouldn't be that easy. These books were not just objects. They were something more. Something alive. And something was still writing. As if in answer, a sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tap echoed through the apartment. Knocking. The sound sent ice through Thomas's veins. Evelyn went rigid. Neither of them moved. Another knock. Louder. Tap. 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 Not from the door. From the window. Slowly, Evelyn turned her head. A shadow loomed on the other side of the glass. Not a person. Not quite. Something that shifted and flickered like ink spilled across paper. And then, a finger, impossibly long and thin, reached up and dragged itself across the glass. The ink was trying to get inside. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 3:41 a.m. 1 minute left. The scratching sound was unbearable. A slow, deliberate drag of something sharp across the windowpane, like the tip of a pen carving words into glass. Evelyn clutched the notebook to her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Thomas stood frozen beside her, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Then, tap, tap, tap. 3 deliberate knocks. The sound was almost polite, almost patient. But Thomas knew better. He didn't dare look at the clock, but he knew what it would say. 3:42 a.m. The time written in the book. The moment it would come for him. The shadow beyond the glass did not shift, did not flinch. It only waited. The ink does not forget. The ink does not forgive. "Thomas," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's watching." The urge to run surged through him, but he knew instinctively, this was not something you could outrun. Not anymore. His gaze flicked to the notebook in Evelyn's grip. The book had known this moment was coming. It had written it before it happened. And if that was true, he fumbled for his own notebook, flipping to a blank page. The ink inside had never dried. The words had always come to him, always known before he did. Maybe, just maybe, he could write his way out. His hand shook as he pressed the pen to paper. The shadow hesitated. It did not enter. It did not break the glass. It did not take him. He lifted the pen. The ink gleamed wetly against the page. He held his breath. Nothing changed. The shadow remained. And then, impossibly, another sound joined the night. A voice. From beyond the glass. You cannot rewrite the ink. Thomas's entire body went rigid. The voice was not loud, not a whisper, but something else entirely, an echo of something written long ago, something left to fester in the margins of forgotten pages. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. Thomas. Crack. A fracture splintered across the window, a jagged line of ink spreading like veins through the glass. The shadow was coming through. Thomas gripped the pen tighter, forcing his mind to focus, to push past the fear clawing at him. If he couldn't rewrite what was already written, then he needed to write something new. He pressed the pen to the page again, his fingers cramping. The shadow pulled back. It was afraid. It feared the words yet to be written. The ink poured onto the paper, and as the last letter curled into place, something happened. The shadow twitched. Then, impossibly, it staggered back. The ink in the glass pulsed once, then withdrew, the cracks sealing shut as if they had never been there. For one agonizing moment, silence filled the apartment. The air itself felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Then, the shadow was gone. Evelyn exhaled sharply, her whole body trembling. It worked, she whispered. Thomas wasn't so sure. His gaze fell to the notebook in his hands, the fresh ink still glistening on the page. Something told him this was only the beginning. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the ink on the page began to move. New words bled into existence, twisting across the parchment, writing themselves without his hand. You should not have done that. A slow chill crawled up his spine. The ink was not finished with him yet. Thomas had spent days running, searching, writing, trying to escape the ink that had already decided his fate. But now, as he stood alone in his apartment, staring down at the final words scrawled in his notebook, he understood the truth. There was no escape. Not from something that had already been written. The ink had been patient. It had given him time, given him hope. But in the end, it had always known how this would end. The words on the page shimmered, as if alive. You should not have done that. A warning. A sentence with weight. The lights flickered. The air thickened. The ink was here. Thomas turned slowly, expecting to see it, the shadow that had chased him, the thing that had written his name into its story. But the room was empty. Silent. Then, a whisper. Not from the walls. Not from the darkness. From inside him. You have written for too long, Thomas. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the pen in his hand. And then, his hands weren't his anymore. The pen moved. His fingers, guided by something unseen, pressed the nib against the page. The ink spilled forth. A writer must know when to stop. His heart pounded as his hand jerked violently across the paper, writing words he did not think, did not choose. But you did not stop. You tried to change what was already written. And now, the ink must correct its mistake. Thomas gasped, struggling against his own muscles, his own bones. But the pen kept moving. The story must end. His breath turned ragged. The room around him shuddered. The walls cracked like paper torn at the edges. The world itself, his world, was unraveling. And then, the ink wrote its final words. Thomas Alden never existed. A violent pull. A sensation like falling, like being erased. His voice caught in his throat. He reached out, but his hands, his arms, were already fading, turning to ink, dissolving into the words themselves. The notebook trembled. The final sentence burned itself onto the page. And then, silence. The ink dried. The story was finished. Days later, Evelyn sat in her apartment, staring at a blank notebook. She had searched for Thomas. No records. No traces. No memory of him. It was as if he had never been written at all. And yet, something made her open her own book again, flipping through the pages filled with his handwriting. At the very end, beneath the last entry, new words had appeared. Handwriting that was unmistakably his. Evelyn, the ink does not forget. The ink does not forgive. And now, it has found you. The pen on her desk rolled by itself. And outside, in the darkness, something knocked at the window. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts. If you're craving more mysteries, thrillers, and spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss out on the next chapter. The darkness is always waiting, and the next story could be just around the corner. See you in the next one, if you dare.